Yes, hello. Ni hao, ni hao. I'm Ilene Serlin. I'm honored to be here today with all of you, Mark Yang, your training, to talk about humanistic existential psychology and why it's so important for us to continue this tradition. So I will start with an introduction. I'm very aware right now in my personal life, I'm a grandmother. I have 3 grandchildren and are very aware of the generations. As we teach the children, they teach their children. It makes me think of my teachers and what I learned from my teachers. And at this point in my life, Erik Erikson's stages, generativity versus despair, the need to pass on to the next generation what we've learned. I've had a lifetime of excellent training and teachers, and I would like to pass on what I can to those of you of the next generation, and you are teaching the future generations of what comes down. I'm also aware that although humanistic existential psychology is new, it's also ancient. That we stand on the shoulders of many people, of many philosophers, of many scientists, of Freud, of Aristotle and Plato and Nietzsche, and each generation brings it to a new application of psychology, the study of human beings. Why existential humanistic? Just personally, my own study of psychology was in the 1960s in the United States, which was a time of great freedom and exploration. And some of us, we were studying for the 2 kinds of psychology at that time. Number 1 was Freudian psychology. Number 2 was behavioral, Skinner. And in the 60s, we were beginning to say, this is too determined. And Freud and Skinner, it's very important. But that belief was that much change happens in your childhood. And that's where it's important. And some of us really thought that you continue to grow and develop throughout life. And that there's human potential to go beyond your childhood and to keep growing. And so we formed a study group at the University of Michigan called Humanistic Psychology, and we read Abraham Maslow, and we discovered Rollo May and Carl Rogers. And so that was very exciting to me. And I went to the second Conference of Humanistic Psychology, 1968, in Washington, D.C., and so that became really my home base. At the same time, I've always been interested in dance, especially folk dance, because I love different countries and the dances of different cultures in different countries. But up to then, it had nothing to do with my studies of psychology. And I began asking people, when I finished studies of psychology at the University of Michigan, why, when I take a dance class, I feel so different. My emotions change, the way I see the world changes. I was doing research on Q-Sort and even Carl Rogers at the Institute for Social Research, and I found it quite boring. And I was interested in this active psychology. So people said, go to this Conference of Humanistic, and there you will meet Anna Halpern, who was an early dance pioneer. I came out to California and did not go on with academic psychology. We began dancing in the mountains, in the forest, doing Tai Chi in the ocean, and just learning about the body and moving in a natural way. And then in 1961, the first systematic program of dance therapy started in the United States. And so I went to New York City, and I was in the first class of dance therapy. And this was an amazing experience. We worked in psychiatric hospitals with people who were nonverbal. We worked with children who were autistic. We worked with people who had schizophrenic, catatonic, no words, no verbal language. Through movement, through rhythm, we began to communicate with these people. And I was so impressed by the power of the body. So I spent those next years, the 1970s, in New York, completing my studies in dance therapy. We learned, Irmgard Bartenieff was my teacher. She was a student of Rudolf von Laban in Germany around the turn of the century. There was a lot of experimentation. Rudolf Steiner, Eurythmics, they were all looking for new ways to go back to nature, to get away from the mechanical world of technology. Way back in the Romantic era of German Romanticism, also German Nietzsche and Husserl and Heidegger were all experimenting with how do we come back to the natural world. And they were doing that in dance too. So we were dancing in the mountains, and we were dancing improvisation, creating new dances. And Irmgard Bartenieff brought a special language for dance notation. Up until then, they had no way to, like music has a notation system with notes and rhythms, you can write it. Dance didn't have it. You danced and it vanished. We learned time, weight, space, flow to graph. We learned to analyze our personal movement style, like movement analysis. We all have our strengths, our preferences, and movement. We have to know our body is the instrument in this way of working. 2 years we studied. We looked at ourselves in videotape. How do I move? What do I communicate to other people? We learned to read other people's movement. The whole range from pathological movement, which is everything from extreme states, to normal movement. We looked at different leadership styles in movement, the decision maker in movement, the visionary person in movement, and how each way of movement has certain strengths that you can work with, or certain parts of yourself that need to be developed. So this was a very exciting time in New York to be part of the world of dance and creativity. But I missed the world of psychology and theory and thinking. I went to the University of Dallas to do my PhD in psychology. And there we studied phenomenology. And that to me was, in New York, the most important part. I was in therapy with someone who did not understand what happened in the dance and in the dance therapy. I kept saying, who understands, what kind of therapist can understand how this movement is impacting me so much? I want to understand this. And people would say, go to Laura Pearl's. And she lived in New York, and I thought, I went to see her, and she said, yes, I will work with you. $20 an hour. Yeah. We met in her home, and we would work together where I would explain a situation, and then we would take that situation and make a movement and explore it in experience. Or we would take an experience and process it in words. And we would go back and forth, verbal, nonverbal, because Laura had a background in dance, in eurythmy. She was a concert pianist. We played two-hand Bach inventions together on the piano. She said everything is dialogue. And to really understand culture is an important part of communication, and to bring the arts in. I ended up, she'd say, go study theory with this person, go study with that person, be in her morning group, be in her evening group. And after 3 years, she says, you have graduated the Gestalt Institute. And so she and I began to work together and train together, verbal to nonverbal, back and forth, back and forth. It was a very important part of my life. She became, as some of you know, my grandmother. And I've always looked for not mother figures so much to learn from, but grandmothers, wise women. And she was my first wise woman teacher. I was with her when she died. I was teaching in Zurich at the Jung Institute, and she was in Pforzheim, her hometown, which is near Munich. And I was very close with her daughter and her granddaughter, who was an art therapist. And they said, come quickly, she is sick and she's close. And I went from Zurich down to Pforzheim. I arrived on a Friday night. We went to see her where she chose to be buried between the two most important men in her life, Fritz, her husband, and her father. And we went to see this place Friday night. On Saturday morning, she died. And we were all standing around her at that moment. So I always carry her with me. Her first book that was written together with her husband and Paul Goodman, they wrote it together sitting at the kitchen table day after day, Ego, Hunger, and Aggression. When the book was published, her name was not on it. It was only the men. As I said to some of you this morning, that was very disturbing to me. And I made a decision at that point that I would dedicate part of my teaching and my own training to keeping the voice of the women alive, because her perspective on Gestalt therapy was very different than Fritz Perls. And for the sake of history and the teaching of psychology, I think it's very important to keep a well-rounded perspective and keep the women's voices in. And as people kept saying to her she should write more, she should write, she said she's not interested in writing big theories. She's interested in her students and their life. And until the end of her life, she would go back to Germany. She kept close friendships in her hometown, and it was always relationships that were the most important thing. However, when we look back on history, it's often those who wrote the books that determine the history and what gets passed on. And it's often men who have the support or the finances or the time to write these books, and the women are taking care of the children or busy in the families, so they don't write these books. And so we need to keep these voices in the history. So that was where my commitment, yes, I'm very moved talking about Laura Perls, came from. After that, I did an internship at the Jung Institute in Los Angeles, because I'm always drawn to symbols and myths, and that's a big connection I have with Rollo May. But why am I not a Jungian? Well, even Carl Jung said, thank goodness I'm not a Jungian, because it becomes almost like too restrictive. And if you already interpret a symbol, this means a cave, this is a phallic symbol, a tree is a cave represents the feminine, the ocean represents the unconscious. The vocabulary is very nice, but I prefer the existential gestalt, which is to start with an attitude of we don't know what any of this means. Let the image speak. And so maybe it's not a tree, maybe is a water, maybe is not a calm lake. Maybe it's a crazy waterfall, or maybe it's ice. If I have a dream about water, if I become the water and I explore the image with my body, it may tell me, no, you're a waterfall. You're a chaotic waterfall, you're not a calm lake. So I don't know what images or symbols mean until I take them into my body and experience them. And that's the point of phenomenology. The Gestalt of Humanistic is we start with an attitude of naive. I don't know what anything means. And when we work with a client, we don't interpret for them. We don't assume what anything means. We try to help them explore. And that meaning emerges. Meaning comes from the experience. So that's why my home, although I love symbols and stories and myths, I don't want to put them on top of somebody's experience. I want to let the experience speak. So my primary perspective is still existential humanistic. Although I bring into my own understanding these universal stories and myths that all human beings share in all cultures. The other thing, when I was in the 70s in New York, many of us were exploring Buddhism, and we were fascinated by the East. Alan Watts and others brought meditation, and we were doing yoga. And for 15 years, I had a teacher of Tibetan Buddhism. But I thought, I don't really want to. I actually talked to Joseph Campbell about this, who agreed with Jung that we can't just leave our own culture and our own traditions and become someone else's culture. We have to deal with our own culture and our own traditions. So I wanted to stay in Western psychology, and for me the closest Gestalt, phenomenology, existential were the closest in the West, but I feel a real kinship with the Eastern psychology. I felt when I came here in 2008, 2010, and we had the conferences on existential humanistic in Nanjing and in other places, Mark Yang, Lewis Hoffman, that I think we were all very careful to say, in China, psychology is just starting. Don't be too fast to take Western psychology as your own. Look at your own culture and your own philosophy. You have a very rich, very ancient history of poetry and philosophy. See what your own kind of psychology emerges. And I still think that existentialism is close to Taoism. We say, go with the flow, see what happens, be open. But in existentialism, we have the opposite of boundaries and freedom. And I think that's a little bit like Confucian traditions, rules and expectations, but we also have the freedom and the flow, Taoism. So I think you understand that very much, or I think we understand each other, maybe from the West and the East, in these shared traditions. So it's a very exciting time, I think, to be in China, because I'm so aware that we are at the point of globalization now, where the East and the West are coming together. We want to respect the new inventions, technology, and Facebook and WeChat, but we also want to keep our traditions and our culture. So this balance between the universal and the particular, the specific and home, and going abroad and different cultures, but knowing your roots, knowing where your home is, knowing your traditions. So as in China, you are finding your way to your own kind of psychology. What I would like to share is both that the body is part of it, that experience is part of psychology. I think in China you have a very holistic, that I don't think the mind and the body in your philosophies has been separated. I think that you have tradition of martial arts, of Qigong, of Tai Chi, that when I say in a group, share energy, give energy to, you don't look at me like this is something very strange. So it's exciting for me to be here because I think this holistic way of seeing the individual and the importance of the individual and the family and tradition is something that is very natural here. And then finally, as a woman, I have my teachers of Rollo May, of Laura Pearls, also of James Hillman and the Jungians. And they are integrated in me, in my experience. And I want to pass that integration so that you, in your way, as the next generation, make it your own. You add your own experiences and your own culture, and then you pass that on. And that together we are part of this lineage of passing on our learning, our traditions, with respect to the fact that we didn't invent it. This is long, but it changes over time as each new generation, as each new culture brings its own rich traditions to it. So I think that's where we are right now. I see this next generation, very young, and I welcome your questions and your comments.